Frozen wolf begs man to enter the cabin. He is shocked by what happens next. On a freezing winter night, deep in the heart of the forest, a lone man hears an eerie sound at his door. Expecting a wayward traveler or perhaps a stray dog, he opens it, only to be met with something far more unexpected. A wolf, not just any wolf, but one battered by the storm, its thick fur matted with frost, ice clinging to its muzzle. It stands hunched, panting heavily, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Its amber eyes, sharp yet desperate, lock onto him with an intensity that sends a shiver down his spine. What would you do if a creature of the wild turned to you for help? Would you slam the door? Or would you take the risk and let it in? This isn't just a story about survival. It's about trust, connection, and the unexpected ways life gives us exactly what we need, even when it arrives on four legs, wrapped in ice and shadows. The wind howled through the dense spruce and fir trees of the valley, bending their frosted branches into unnatural shapes. Snowflakes, like frozen whispers, spiraled against the log walls of Howard Grayson's cabin. Inside, the dim glow of a cast-iron wood stove cast flickering shadows across the room. Howard sat slumped in an old leather chair, staring at the tattered Nikon D850 camera resting on the wooden table beside him. For nearly 2 years, this camera had been his only link to the outside world, capturing the raw, untamed beauty of this isolated patch of Montana near Glacier National Park. The walls of his cabin were lined with photographs: elk grazing in the morning mist, a bald eagle soaring over Lake McDonald, a snow-covered ridge catching the first light of dawn. Yet tonight, despite the comfort of these familiar images, the cabin felt suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that pressed on his chest, reminding him of all he had lost. Then came a sound, a low, drawn-out whimper. Howard sat up, his pulse quickening. The noise was faint, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakably close. He turned toward the frost-covered window, squinting into the white abyss beyond. Shadows shifted in the dim light, the towering pines swaying with the storm. Then, movement. A dark shape, low to the ground, hunched and trembling near the porch. Howard's breath caught in his throat. A wolf. Not the proud, ghost-like predator he had seen darting through the trees in warmer months, moving with effortless grace. No, this wolf was different. Its body was thin, its fur clumped with ice and snow. Each breath it took came in heavy, uneven gasps, steam rising from its muzzle in ragged bursts. One of its front legs hovered above the snow, tucked close to its chest as if injured. Howard's instincts screamed at him to stay inside. A wolf was no lost dog. It was a predator, a creature of the wild, unpredictable and dangerous, especially when desperate. And yet, its golden eyes met his through the glass. There was no aggression, no warning snarl, only pain, a plea. Howard hesitated for only a moment before grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen counter. His fingers tightened around the handle as he took a steadying breath, then stepped toward the door. Howard cracked the door open, and a gust of icy wind rushed in, biting at his face. He lifted the flashlight, its beam cutting through the swirling snow, illuminating the wolf's battered frame. The animal barely reacted to the sudden light. It only shifted slightly, its ears flicking once before locking eyes with him again. Up close, the damage was worse than he had initially thought. Its fur was patchy, its ribs faintly visible beneath the thick coat, and frost clung to its whiskers like tiny shards of glass.
"You shouldn't be here,"
Howard muttered under his breath, half expecting the wolf to bolt. Instead, the creature let out a low, guttural whine and took a limping step forward. The movement was unsteady, its injured paw barely touching the snow before it collapsed again. Howard clenched his jaw. Every rational part of him told him to close the door, to let nature take its course. This was a wild animal. If he let it inside, he had no idea how it would react. But something about the wolf's eyes held him in place. They weren't the eyes of a creature looking to attack. They were the eyes of something on the edge of collapse, of something that had been fighting to survive for too long and had finally run out of strength.
"Damn it,"
Howard muttered, grabbing a thick wool blanket from a nearby chair. He took a cautious step onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. The wolf tensed, its ears twitching. Its body trembled violently, not from fear, but from exhaustion and cold.
Easy.
Howard murmured, his voice low and steady. He crouched a few feet away, holding the blanket out like an offering.
I'm not gonna hurt you.
The wolf let out a shaky breath, its muscles twitching beneath its frozen fur. Slowly it lowered its head, as if resigning itself to whatever was about to happen. Howard inched closer, his own breath fogging in the frigid air. When he was near enough, he reached out carefully, draping the heavy wool blanket over the wolf's shivering frame. The animal flinched at the warmth but didn't resist.
All right,
Howard said, standing.
let's get you inside before we both freeze out here.
Moving cautiously, he stepped back toward the open door. To his surprise, the wolf, despite its injuries, made an effort to follow. It stumbled forward, dragging its wounded leg, its breath coming in short, pained bursts. Once inside, the wolf collapsed onto the wooden floor with a heavy thud. Its body was still tense, muscles coiled even in exhaustion, but it made no move to flee. Howard remained standing near the door, gripping the back of a chair for balance. A wolf, a full-grown, injured wolf, was now lying in his cabin, mere feet away from him. And yet, despite the sheer insanity of the situation, he felt no fear. Only a strange, unexpected sense of purpose. He grabbed the first aid kit from a cabinet, along with an old towel and a small jar of honey, the real Montana clover honey he had picked up months ago from a roadside stand. He set the jar down near the wolf, uncertain if it would eat in its condition. To his astonishment, the wolf's nose twitched. It let out a weak woof before extending its tongue, lapping at the sticky sweetness.
That's it.
Howard murmured.
You'll be all right. We'll figure this out.
As he crouched beside the injured animal, exhaustion pressed down on him. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that suffocated him. It was the kind that came with purpose. The kind that made him feel, if only for a moment, alive again. Outside, the wind howled on, but inside there was only the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of a wolf's slow, steady breathing. Dawn broke slowly over the valley, the first pale streaks of light filtering through the frost-rimmed windows. Outside, the storm had left a thick, undisturbed blanket of snow, broken only by the faint impressions of paw prints leading up to the porch. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with warmth from the wood stove, the fire casting long golden shadows across the floor. But the warmth did little to chase away the chill deep in Howard's bones. He had spent the night in his old leather chair, dozing lightly, his ears attuned to the sounds of his unexpected guest. The wolf lay curled on the floor, still wrapped in the blanket he had draped over it the night before. Its sides rose and fell in uneven breaths, its fur damp where the melted frost had soaked through. Howard rubbed his eyes and sat forward, studying the animal with cautious curiosity. For years he had photographed wolves from a distance, admiring their elusive, almost spectral presence in the wilderness. They were creatures of myth and instinct, wild spirits that belonged to the shadows between trees. And yet here one lay, close enough that he could reach out and touch it. The wolf stirred, its ears twitching before its golden eyes flickered open. For a moment it remained still, only its gaze shifting to find him. Then slowly it lifted its head, alert but exhausted.
Hey there.
Howard said quietly. The wolf didn't growl or bare its teeth. It only watched him, its breath coming in slow, deliberate puffs. Howard reached for the first aid kit he had set aside the night before. His fingers trembled slightly as he sorted through the supplies. Antiseptic wipes, bandages, a small tube of antibiotic ointment. These were meant for human wounds, but they would have to do. He moved cautiously, keeping his voice low.
I'm gonna help you.
He murmured.
Just don't bite me, okay?
The wolf's injured leg was stretched awkwardly in front of it, the gash on its paw deep and rimmed with blackened frostbite. Howard took a steadying breath and reached out. The wolf flinched at the first touch, a low warning rumble rising in its throat. Howard froze, his heart hammering.
Easy.
He soothed.
I know it hurts. Just hold still.
The rumble subsided, though the wolf's body remained tense. Working as gently as he could, Howard cleaned the wound. wincing at the sharp, pained breath the wolf let out. The gash was worse than he had thought, raw and inflamed.
You've been through hell, haven't you?
He muttered, carefully applying ointment before wrapping the leg in layers of gauze. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, exhaling.
Not perfect,
He admitted.
but it'll do for now.
The wolf studied him, its expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, it carefully shifted its weight, testing the bandaged paw.
Guess that makes us even.
Howard murmured. He stood and moved to the kitchen, rummaging through the cabinets. He had no fresh meat. His supplies were mostly canned goods. But after a brief search, he found a tin of salmon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The sharp, metallic click of the can opener drew the wolf's attention. Its nose twitched as Howard placed the open tin a few feet away and stepped back, giving it space. The wolf hesitated, then dragged itself toward the food. It ate slowly, every movement heavy with exhaustion. Howard leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching in silence. Why had the wolf come to him? How had it known he would help? And what had driven it to such desperation in the first place? The storm had passed, but outside the world felt eerily still, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck rise, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The wolf finished eating and laid its head on the floor, its breathing slowing into a steady rhythm. Howard crouched down, retrieving the empty can. He couldn't help but smile faintly.
You're a fighter, aren't you?
He murmured.
Guess that makes two of us.
For the rest of the day, the cabin settled into a rhythm of cautious peace. Howard busied himself with small tasks, adding logs to the fire, sweeping the floor, checking the generator. But all the while, he kept one eye on the wolf. By midday, the sun had broken through the clouds, casting pale beams of light across the snow. Taking advantage of the clearer weather, Howard stepped outside to check his surroundings. The cold bit at his cheeks as he trudged through the drifts. The forest seemed different now, more watchful. The usual sounds of bird calls and rustling branches were absent, replaced only by the distant creak of trees bending under the weight of snow. Something felt off. When he returned to the cabin, the wolf was awake. Its head was lifted, ears pricked forward, eyes locked onto the door. Howard frowned.
What is it?
He asked, closing the door behind him. The wolf didn't respond, of course, but its posture was deliberate, intentional. It was waiting, watching, and Howard was beginning to suspect that whatever had brought the wolf to his cabin wasn't over yet. As the afternoon light faded, Howard found himself pacing near the window, casting wary glances at the wolf. It hadn't moved much since he'd returned, but its gaze remained fixed on the door, unblinking, as if listening to something beyond the human range of hearing. Howard exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand through his unkempt hair.
What's out there?
He murmured, not expecting an answer. The wolf flicked an ear but didn't look at him. Instead, it shifted slightly, wincing as it adjusted its injured paw. Something was wrong. The forest was never truly silent, not even in winter. There were always faint sounds, the groan of branches bending under snow, the distant call of a raven, the whisper of wind through pine needles. But now an eerie stillness had settled over the land. It was the kind of quiet that set instincts on edge. The wolf knew something he didn't. Howard moved toward the door, hesitating with his hand on the knob. His rifle was still hanging on the wall, untouched since the day he had retreated to this isolated life. He wasn't one to shoot unless absolutely necessary, but a cold sense of unease slithered through his gut. The wolf let out a soft huff. When Howard turned back, its amber eyes met his with an expression that could only be described as urging.
You want me to follow you?
He muttered. The wolf didn't growl or whine, just held his gaze. Then with a slow, deliberate effort, it pushed itself onto 3 legs and took an unsteady step toward the door. Howard felt his breath catch. The message was clear. Something was waiting outside. With a steadying inhale, he grabbed his thick parka and pulled it over his shoulders. The temperature had dropped again, and the cold would be merciless. He tucked a hunting knife into his belt, just in case, and grabbed a flashlight before opening the door. The wolf limped past him into the snow, its injured leg dragging slightly behind. Howard hesitated, glancing back at the warmth of the cabin, then stepped outside, following the trail of paw prints leading away from the porch. The cold hit him like a wall, sharp and relentless. His boots crunched over hardened snow as he followed the wolf's uneven steps. It moved with a quiet urgency, its ears constantly twitching, nostrils flaring, as if scenting something he couldn't perceive. The forest stretched before them in an endless expanse of whitened shadow, the trees casting skeletal fingers across the snow. Howard kept a cautious distance, his pulse quickening with every step.
Where are you taking me?
He muttered under his breath, but the wolf didn't react. It led him deeper, weaving between towering spruces and over frozen drifts. The landscape was familiar. He had explored these woods countless times, but something about the atmosphere felt different tonight. The silence pressed against him like a held breath. Then the wolf stopped. Howard nearly ran into it, catching himself just in time. He followed the wolf's gaze and felt his stomach drop. A ravine. The slope ahead of them dipped sharply downward into a shallow, snow-covered trench. At the bottom, nestled against the base of a jagged rock outcrop, something dark shifted in the dim light. Howard's grip on his flashlight tightened. He flicked it on, the beam cutting through the dusk. And there, half buried in the snow, were two smaller shapes. His breath caught in his throat. Pups. They were barely more than bundles of fur, curled tightly against each other in the freezing cold. Their tiny chests rose and fell in shallow, unsteady breaths. One let out a weak whimper, a sound so faint that the wind nearly carried it away. Howard swallowed hard, glancing at the injured wolf beside him.
You've got pups.
He whispered. The mother wolf let out a low, shuddering breath. Howard had seen enough wildlife documentaries to know that without warmth and food, the pups wouldn't make it through the night. His jaw tightened. They wouldn't survive out here, not like this. He had two options. Leave them, knowing what fate awaited them, or take them back to the cabin, risking everything by bringing not just one wolf, but an entire family into his home. The mother wolf nudged one of the pups with her nose. The movement was weak, almost pleading. Howard sighed, his breath misting in the cold.
All right.
He muttered.
Guess we're doing this.
Kneeling carefully, he removed his gloves and reached for the first pup. Its fur was stiff with ice, and it barely reacted to his touch. He gathered it gently in his arms, cradling its fragile body against his chest. The second pup followed, its tiny paws twitching as he lifted it. The mother wolf limped closer, her eyes locked onto his every move. Howard met her gaze.
Come on, let's get them inside.
The trek back to the cabin was slow and arduous. The snow deepened with each step, and Howard's arms ached from carrying the pups. He held them close, shielding them from the worst of the wind. Behind him, the mother wolf followed, her movements sluggish but determined. Howard pushed forward, every step fueled by a single thought. Keep moving. At last, the cabin came into view. Its golden light spilled into the darkness, a beacon against the endless white. Relief surged through him as he reached the porch, kicking the door open with his boot. Warmth hit him instantly, wrapping around his frozen limbs. He stepped inside, closing the door behind them, sealing out the cold. He knelt by the fire, laying the pups onto a thick wool blanket near the wood stove. They trembled, their tiny bodies curling into the warmth. The mother wolf hesitated at the threshold, her massive frame silhouetted against the night. Howard turned to her, his voice soft.
Come on.
He murmured.
It's safe.
For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she stepped inside, her claws clicking softly against the wooden floor. She padded over to her pups, nudging them with her nose. One let out a soft whimper, curling into her warmth. Howard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. They had made it. The hours passed in quiet rhythm. Howard moved carefully, tending to the pups while keeping a cautious eye on their mother. She remained close to them, her body curled protectively around their small forms. But every now and then, her gaze would shift toward him, not with hostility, but with something almost like understanding. He sat against the wall, exhaustion tugging at him. For years he had sought solitude, retreating from the world to escape his own grief. And yet in saving these wolves, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing. Purpose. As he watched the mother wolf rest, her pups nestled against her side, a thought settled deep in his chest, one he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long, long time. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had once believed. The storm outside had calmed, but the air inside the cabin was thick with something heavier than the lingering cold. Howard sat in his old leather chair, arms crossed, eyes locked on the mother wolf and her pups. The fire crackled, casting flickering light across the wooden floor. The pups had stopped shivering, their tiny bodies nestled against their mother's thick fur, their breathing slow but steady. Howard sighed, leaning his head back against the chair. He had spent years alone in these woods, keeping the world at arm's length, and now he had 3 wolves sleeping by his fire. What the hell was he doing? This wasn't sustainable. He had enough supplies to get through the winter, but his food wasn't meant for wild animals. More importantly, wolves didn't belong in a cabin. They belonged out there, in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. And yet, as he looked at the mother wolf curled protectively around her young, something in his chest tightened. She had come to him, she had trusted him, and he couldn't just abandon them. Howard ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pressing down on him.
Guess we'll figure it out.
He murmured. The mother wolf's ears flicked, acknowledging his voice, but she didn't move. The next few days settled into an uneasy routine. Howard kept his distance, careful not to overstep the fragile boundary between himself and the wolves. The mother, though still weak, grew more alert each day. She watched his every move, her golden eyes filled with an intelligence that made his skin prickle. The pups, on the other hand, were less cautious. By the second morning, the stronger of the two, an energetic little thing with dark gray fur, had begun exploring the cabin. It sniffed at the furniture, pawed at Howard's boots, and even attempted to chew the corner of an old blanket. Howard had chuckled despite himself.
You're trouble, aren't you?
The pup had wagged its tail, just a small, hesitant flick, but it was enough to make something inside him crack just a little. The mother wolf never interfered, though she watched her pup closely. She was learning, testing the boundaries of this strange new world. By the 4th day, Howard was confident enough to touch the mother's injured paw again. She flinched but didn't growl as he carefully changed the bandages. The wound was healing, but it would take time.
You're lucky you found me.
He muttered as he worked, his fingers deft and gentle.
Or maybe I'm the lucky one. I haven't decided yet.
The wolf huffed softly, and Howard could have sworn it sounded almost amused. On the 6th night, the wind changed. Howard knew the moment it happened. He had lived in the wilderness long enough to recognize the subtle shift in pressure, the way the trees outside went deathly still. A storm was coming, not a blizzard like the one before, but something else. Something that made his skin crawl. The mother wolf knew it too. She was on edge, ears perked, nose twitching as she stared at the door. Howard frowned, setting down the tin cup of coffee he had been nursing.
What is it?
The wolf didn't answer, of course, but she stood, moving away from the fire for the first time since she had arrived. She limped toward the door, her tail stiff, body tense. Howard's stomach tightened. Something was out there. He rose to his feet, grabbing his rifle from where it had remained untouched on the wall. He rarely used it, preferring to live in harmony with the land rather than fight against it. But an unsettling instinct whispered that tonight, he might need it. Moving cautiously, he unlatched the door and cracked it open just enough to peer outside. At first he saw nothing, just the same frozen expanse of snow, the towering trees, and the pale glow of the moon reflecting off the ice. Then movement, a shadow low to the ground, creeping along the tree line. Howard stiffened. Another wolf. No, not just one. Several. His breath hitched as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. Shapes moved between the trees, dark bodies slipping through the snow, barely making a sound. A pack. He swallowed hard. This wasn't just a random encounter. They had come for something, and Howard had a sickening feeling he knew exactly what. Behind him, the mother wolf let out a low, throaty growl. It wasn't aggressive. It was a warning. Howard turned back to her, heart pounding.
Are they yours?
He asked, even though he knew she wouldn't answer. She didn't look at him. Her eyes remained locked on the wolves outside. Howard exhaled sharply, gripping the rifle tighter. He had to think. If these were her packmates, why hadn't they come sooner? Had they been searching for her? Or had she been running from them? His mind raced. Wolves weren't like bears. They didn't abandon their own. A pack was a family bound by an unspoken hierarchy, a balance of power and loyalty. If they were here, it meant one of two things. They had come to reclaim her, or they had come to finish what nature had started. Howard clenched his jaw. He wouldn't let that happen. Turning on his heel, he moved toward the fire, grabbing a thick piece of wood from the pile beside the stove. With one quick motion, he thrust it into the flames, holding it there until the tip caught. The moment the firelight danced against the wood, the wolves outside shifted. They had seen. Good. Howard stepped back to the door, now fully open, and thrust the burning log into the night. The sudden burst of light cast wild shadows across the snow, illuminating the pack in full. 7 wolves, lean and watchful, stood there, all eyes fixed on Howard, but none advanced. The mother wolf let out another growl, lower and more commanding this time. Howard saw it happen in real time. The pack hesitated. Some flicked their ears back. Others took a step away. A moment passed, then another. Just like that, the lead wolf, a massive black male with piercing silver eyes, turned and disappeared into the trees. One by one, the others followed, their dark forms swallowed by the shadows. Howard stood there for a long time, breath fogging in the cold air. When he finally turned back to the mother wolf, she was watching him. Not with fear, not with hesitation, but with something that almost resembled respect. Howard closed the door, shutting out the cold once more. The pups were still sleeping, oblivious to what had just happened. He turned to the mother wolf, exhaling shakily.
They're gone.
She blinked slowly. He rubbed the back of his neck.
They came for you, and you didn't go.
The silence stretched between them. Finally, Howard sighed, running a hand through his hair.
What now?
He wasn't sure who he was asking, the wolf, the universe, himself. But as the fire crackled and the mother wolf settled beside her pups once more, he realized something. The choice wasn't his to make. She had already chosen, and for now, just for now, she had chosen to stay. The fire burned low in the cabin, its glow flickering across the wooden walls. Howard sat at the table, fingers wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, his eyes drifting between the sleeping wolf pups and their mother. She had chosen to stay, for now. The realization settled heavily in his chest. He had spent years running from the world, avoiding attachments, convincing himself that solitude was the only way to survive his grief. And yet here he was, sharing his cabin with a wolf and her young. Howard exhaled slowly, setting his coffee down. He glanced at the mother wolf, who lay curled protectively around her pups. Her breathing was steady, but her ears twitched every now and then, her instincts never fully at rest. She was still healing, still regaining her strength. And even though she had sent her pack away, he knew she would eventually have to return to the wild. Because that's what wolves did. The thought settled uneasily in his stomach. Howard ran a hand through his hair, standing up.
Guess I should figure out what the hell I'm doing with you.
The mother wolf cracked an eye open but didn't move. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Howard hunted when he could, setting traps in the forest and rationing the last of his supplies. He couldn't keep feeding the wolves from his own stores, not if he wanted to make it through the winter himself, but the mother wolf, despite her injury, was recovering. She began moving more, limping around the cabin, her golden eyes always watching him. The pups grew bolder too, their small bodies no longer trembling with cold. The stronger pup, the one with dark gray fur, was the most curious. It would sniff at his boots, paw at the wooden floor, even try to nip at his coat when he wasn't looking. Howard smirked one evening as the pup tugged on the sleeve of his jacket.
You've got some nerve, little guy.
The pup huffed, tail wagging slightly. Its sibling, smaller and quieter, preferred to stick close to their mother, watching with cautious eyes. Howard had started calling them Trouble and Shadow. Not out loud. He wasn't ready to admit he was naming wolves, but the words formed naturally in his mind. The mother wolf, of course, was simply her. She was still a mystery, still a creature he couldn't quite categorize. But as the days stretched on, something unspoken formed between them, a fragile trust. By the 10th day, the mother wolf was strong enough to walk outside. Howard had left the cabin door open while chopping wood, and when he turned, he saw her standing in the snow, her head high, ears flicking as she took in the landscape. He froze, watching her carefully. This was it, wasn't it? The moment she'd leave. She had stayed longer than he expected, but she was still wild. And wild things didn't belong in warm cabins with wooden floors and crackling fires. The pups bounded after her, their small bodies sinking into the snow. Howard swallowed hard, setting the axe down. If she walked away now, he wouldn't stop her. He couldn't, but she didn't move. She stood there for a long moment, nose lifted to the wind, her golden eyes scanning the distant tree line. The pups, oblivious to the weight of the moment, pounced at each other, their playful yips echoing in the cold air. Then the mother wolf turned and limped back inside. Howard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The weeks passed and the harshness of winter began to loosen its grip. The deep snowdrifts became patchy, revealing glimpses of the frozen earth beneath. The air, though still sharp, carried the faintest promise of spring. Howard found himself stepping outside more often, his camera in hand, capturing the slow transition of the land. But more than anything, he found himself watching the wolves. He watched as Shadow, the cautious pup, learned to track scents in the snow, always a step behind his mother. He watched as Trouble, bold as ever, climbed onto his woodpile and promptly fell off, shaking himself indignantly before trying again. And he watched as she, the mother wolf, grew stronger. Her limp was nearly gone. Her fur, once matted and tangled, had regained its luster. She was no longer the desperate frozen creature that had collapsed on his doorstep weeks ago. She was whole again, and Howard knew what that meant. She would leave soon. The thought settled like a stone in his chest. He told himself it was for the best. Wolves didn't belong here. They never had. But knowing something and accepting it were two different things. That evening, Howard sat by the fire, staring at the flames, a familiar heaviness pressing on him. The mother wolf lay nearby, her body curled around the pups. Trouble and Shadow had long since dozed off, their tiny chests rising and falling in steady rhythms. Howard exhaled, rubbing his hands together.
You're gonna leave soon, aren't you?
He didn't expect a response, but the mother wolf lifted her head slightly, her golden eyes meeting his in the firelight. It was a look of understanding, of acknowledgement. Howard's throat tightened. He thought of the last time he had lost someone, the way grief had hollowed him out, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. But this was different. This wasn't loss. This was simply the way of things. He reached for his camera, hesitating for a long moment before lifting it to his eye. The firelight cast long, golden shadows across the floor, framing the wolves in a glow that made them seem almost otherworldly. Howard pressed the shutter. A quiet click. A frozen moment in time. He lowered the camera, exhaling.
Thank you.
He murmured. The mother wolf didn't move, but in the soft flicker of the fire, he could have sworn she understood. Howard woke to silence. The fire had burned low, the warmth fading from the cabin, and the wolves were gone. He sat up slowly, rubbing his hands over his face before standing and moving toward the door. The morning air was crisp, the sky a soft, pale blue. He stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching against the frost. Tracks, leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. Howard exhaled, his breath curling in the cold air. He had known this was coming, and yet as he stood there, staring at the empty space where they had been, a quiet ache settled in his chest. He wasn't sure how long he stood there before he turned back inside. The cabin felt different now. Not empty, exactly, but changed. Howard moved to his camera, still sitting on the table. He flipped through the photos, stopping on the last one he had taken. The mother wolf, her eyes reflecting the firelight, her pups nestled against her side. He smiled faintly, running a hand over his face. Then, for the first time in a long time, he picked up his notebook and began to write.
This winter, a wolf found her way to my door, and in saving her, I found something I thought I had lost. Purpose, connection, the quiet understanding that sometimes the wild comes to us, not to take, but to give.
The forest had taken much from him over the years, but this time it had given something back. The cabin was quiet again, but it was not the same kind of silence that had haunted Howard for years. It wasn't the suffocating weight of loneliness pressing down on his chest. It wasn't the deafening stillness that had filled the space after Claire and Sophie had been taken from him. No, this was a different kind of quiet. It was the hush of something meaningful having passed through, leaving behind a trace of its presence. Howard ran a hand through his beard, staring at the frost-covered window. He had lived through countless winters in this cabin, but none had shaped him like this one. None had left such an imprint on him. With a deep breath, he pulled on his boots and stepped outside. The air was sharp, biting against his skin, but he barely felt it. His eyes scanned the snow, following the trail of paw prints leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the thick of the forest. The wolves were gone. A part of him had expected to see the mother wolf lingering near the tree line, glancing back one last time, but she hadn't, and he understood why. Wolves didn't look back. They moved forward, surviving, adapting, thriving. And so should he. The days stretched on, and winter began to loosen its grip on the land. The snow, once an unforgiving blanket, thinned under the warmth of the afternoon sun. Patches of brown earth peeked through the frost, and icicles dripped steadily from the eaves of the cabin. Howard found himself returning to old habits, but with a quiet shift in his perspective. He took his camera on walks again, but this time, he wasn't just capturing landscapes. He was searching for signs of them. Tracks in the thawing mud, a flash of movement in the trees, a distant howl carried by the wind. He didn't know what he was expecting, maybe nothing at all. But one morning, as he walked along the frozen stream, he saw them, the prints, fresh, unmistakable. A large set of paws accompanied by two smaller ones. His breath caught in his throat. She had made it, and her pups had survived. A small chuckle escaped him, surprising even himself. He knelt in the snow, running his fingers lightly over the tracks as if they might vanish beneath his touch. He traced the shape of the paw prints, shaking his head.
Good girl,
He murmured. The wind picked up, rustling through the branches. Howard exhaled, standing and slinging his camera over his shoulder. Then, with one last glance at the tracks, he turned back toward the cabin. That evening, Howard sat at his wooden table, a journal open before him. For the first time in years, the words came easily. Not in the clinical, detached way he had once written about wildlife. This was something different, something personal.
this winter I learned that survival isn't just about enduring the elements. It's about finding purpose in the unexpected, about knowing when to let go and when to hold on, about trust, even when it feels impossible.
He paused, staring down at the words, then continued.
A wolf came to my door and I let her in. I thought I was saving her. But maybe in the end, she saved me.
Howard sat back, staring at the flickering firelight, the notebook open in front of him. For the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel alone. And maybe, just maybe, he never truly had been. The weeks passed, and spring arrived in full. The forest transformed, snow giving way to damp earth, the first green shoots pushing through the thawing ground. Birds returned, their songs threading through the trees. The world was waking up again. So was Howard. One evening he sat on his porch, watching the sun sink low over the valley. The sky was a mixture of warm golds and soft violets, a reminder that even the coldest winters ended eventually. Then movement caught his eye, a flicker of gray in the trees. Howard's breath stilled. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but then just beyond the clearing, a shape stepped into view, the mother wolf. She stood at the edge of the forest, her golden eyes reflecting the last light of the day. She was whole again, strong, and she was watching him. Howard swallowed, unsure whether to move, unsure whether she would disappear if he so much as blinked. But she didn't leave. Instead, she lowered her head slightly, ears twitching. Then just for a moment, so brief he almost missed it, her tail gave a slow, measured wag. Howard's chest tightened. He lifted his hand, a small, quiet wave. Then just as silently as she had come, she turned and melted back into the trees. Gone, but not lost, never lost. Howard let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. With a small smile, he stood and went inside. He had a story to write. Sometimes the wild doesn't just take, sometimes it gives, and if you're lucky enough, it might just change you in the process.